Welcome to the University of St. Thomas School of Law and the Veterans Defense Project Salute to Veterans in Need of Restorative Justice event. I am Dominic Skawaniak. I am a University of St. Thomas law student. I'm an infantry officer in the Minnesota Army National Guard and a veteran of the wars in Afghanistan and Syria. Thank you for being here with us tonight, and thank you to all my fellow veterans and those who are still currently serving. Tonight's program will begin with a presentation of the National Anthem, sung by University of St. Thomas law alum Anna Johnson. Both of Anna's grandfathers served in the Korean War, and she has several other people in her life that have served, and she honors all of them here tonight with the performance of her national anthem. Please rise and face the flag.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, Anna. Next, we will have United States Attorney Andrew Luger give opening remarks. Andy Luger was appointed by President Joseph Biden and sworn in on March 30th, 2022. As the 37th United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota, as U.S. Attorney, Mr. Luger leads an office that is responsible for prosecuting federal crimes in the district, including crimes related to terrorism, firearms, narcotics, human trafficking, financial fraud, healthcare fraud, public corruption, and tribal justice issues. Please welcome Andy Luger.
At first, I thought I was going to sing the national anthem, but I'm glad I'm not doing that today. What a wonder. Let's give her a round of applause. That was amazing. So I am deeply honored to be able to speak to you briefly today, and particularly honored to speak in an event so appropriately named A Salute to Veterans in Need of Restorative Justice. It's an issue that is close to my heart, and in just a couple of minutes today, I'm going to tell you why. For many years in my life, most of my life, my father was the closest person who I ever knew to me. He was my best friend, he was my advisor, he was filled with wisdom and wit and a quiet and humble way of going about the world. He was also a veteran. My father served in the Navy in the South Pacific on a destroyer in the year before the dropping of the bomb on Japan. And he didn't like to talk about his service, talked about a lot of things, taught me a lot about how to live a life of integrity, honesty, and decency. But over the years, my sisters and I got my father to talk a little bit about his service to our country. And over the snippets, we learned a bit about what he lived through and what he did, until ultimately he opened up to us about a moment in his service at a time that haunted him for the rest of his life. My father passed about 11 years ago. And I won't go into details to protect his privacy and to avoid my breaking down up here. I'm going to just tell you that he lived through, along with everybody on the destroyer, a harrowing moment where they believed they were all going to die. And over the years, every once in a while, he would talk to us about it, and we would talk to him about perhaps speaking with somebody professionally. He was a successful businessman, a great husband, and a great parent, but he had this thing that he lived with that he told us haunted him every day. And so tonight, or today, you're going to have a panel on the invisible injuries for veterans. My father lived a long and fruitful life, but he knew others who he served with who did not fare as well as he did. And so in his honor, and in the honor of all the people who served with him, I salute you for the work that you're doing, and I'm so grateful to be even a small part of today's festivities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andy. Our first panel this evening will be moderated by Ryan Else. Ryan is a co-founder of the Veterans Defense Project, a University of St. Thomas School of Law alumni, and a U.S. Army veteran. So please welcome first panel of the evening.
Briefly introduce the panel before we get started here. Chief Justice Lawton Nuss served in the United States Marine Corps as a combat engineering officer from 1975 to 1979, which was the year I was born, so I've been doing it a long time, Chief. He went on to a legal career that culminated in being appointed to the Kansas Supreme Court in 2002. He served as Chief Justice for 10 years. He currently serves on the executive committee and is coming on as the chair of the Veterans Defense Project Board. Kristine Huskey, seated in the middle, is a clinical professor of law and director of the Veterans Advocacy Law Clinic at the University of Arizona College of Law, where she researches and writes on issues involving veterans in the criminal justice system, tribal healing and wellness courts, and restorative justice. Colonel DJ Reyes is a retired U.S. Army colonel with over 33 years of service. In 2013, he established the Veterans Mentor Program in Tampa, Florida, for their veteran treatment court. Colonel Reyes has been a tireless advocate nationally, lobbying for the Veterans Treatment Court Coordination Act and the PACT Act. And we will also be viewing a video by Judge Roslyn Silver, who served 30 years as a U.S. District Court judge in Arizona, where she has built one of the few federal veterans treatment courts. Professor Huskey, I'll start with you, and would you mind giving us a brief overview of veteran treatment courts and how they work?
Absolutely. I'm a professor, so I'm going to start this out with a question. How many of you have ever heard of a veterans treatment court? Let's see hands. Show of hands. Okay, a lot. That's great. How many have observed one, a hearing? Oh, good. Participated in one as an attorney? Oh, excellent. Okay, so I get to say less now. That's great. All right, well, for those of you who don't know, a veterans treatment court, or a VTC, is a problem-solving court, right? It addresses the underlying problem of the crime, and that problem may be substance abuse, alcohol, mental health, any one of those sorts of things. So a veterans treatment court is such a problem-solving court for veterans who've been charged with a crime. Now, there's a little debate about when the first one was. I grew up in Alaska, so I have to tell you, as a side note, that the first one was in Alaska in 2004, right? But the people say that the godfather of Veterans Treatment Court, and I believe them, is Judge Robert Russell, who started the first really recognized Veterans Treatment Court in a local Buffalo court in 2008. And around that time, there were two armed conflicts that had been already going on for 5 to 7 years, so you had multiple deployments happening. You had the Rand Corporation produce that 2008 amazing sort of seminal report on invisible wounds of warriors about the high rates of PTSD and TBI among the 9/11 cohort. It was 20 to 30% is what the Rand survey was showing. You had disproportionate incarceration rates, and you had very high, and still have, unacceptably high suicide rates of veterans. And so there really was a need to help veterans across the board, and a great need to address veterans and I should say the root causes of criminally involved or justice-involved veterans. And so Judge Russell put it this way, and I still use this quote, I've been using it for over 10 years. The mission driving the Veterans Treatment Court is to successfully habilitate veterans by diverting them from the traditional criminal justice system and provide them with the tools they need in order to lead a productive and law-abiding lifestyle. It's treating veterans suffering from substance abuse issues, alcoholism, mental health issues, and emotional disabilities. So what sounds better than helping veterans? Nothing, right? But in fact, there was resistance to a special court for veterans. People said at the time, why not just send them to drug court or mental health court or some of these other problem-solving courts that we have? Well, as many of you know, a lot of you know, veterans have a bond. So even if they're in the criminal justice system, they have a bond. And it's not drug use, and it's like in drug court, it's not schizophrenia. It's their shared profession. It's your shared profession, right? It's service to their country, to our country. And so VTCs capitalize on these shared experiences, and they incorporate military culture into the rehabilitation and the court process to bolster success of the veteran to come out and to rejoin society and be productive. So VTCs really vary across jurisdiction. Your local Veterans Treatment Court may not look like my local Veterans Treatment Court. It could be in a city court, a county court, a state court, or a federal court. Uncommon, but there are some. It could be misdemeanors, felonies, nonviolent crimes, or nonviolent crimes and violent crimes. It could be pre-plea, post-plea. Charges may get dismissed or sentences, fines reduced. Eligibility also varies. It could be that a Veterans Treatment Court only allows those veterans with honorable discharges and doesn't allow OTHs other than honorable discharges or bad conduct. Many say that that's missing a large majority of veterans who actually need those services. Those veterans with the other than honorable discharges are more likely to not be, well, they're not going to the VA for health care, so they're more likely to have undiagnosed PTSD and more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. Some courts require that the misconduct be connected to the combat injury, PTSD or TBI, or MST, military sexual trauma, caused by being in the military. In Tucson, I like to say, actually, Judge Pollard, who is a Marine, you never say was a Marine, is a Marine, started our court. He says, our court is come one, come all. If you serve today, you're welcome. So as mentioned, some federal courts have veterans diversion programs, but it's not common. And so now we're going to hear from Judge Roslyn Silver, who started her veterans court in 2013. Excuse me. And so she started her court 10 years ago, so she's coming on her 10th anniversary, and that court has about a 75% success rate. And I went to Phoenix and got a chance to meet with her. It was a great honor. And I asked her questions about why she started the court, of course, and challenges encountered, and any advice she might have to judges who want to start a veterans program in their court.
Are we prepared for the video?
Going to be able to do this because I have empathy for the military. I had empathy for what they were doing for us in the United States without having any personal experience with them in my family. And Judge Hawkins wrote a very good law review article that everyone ought to take a look at. And so then it was, how are we going to put this together? And General Maxson got me somebody to put it together. And then I did visit Judge Limbaugh, who Judge Hawkins knew quite well. And so we had a blueprint to do it. And, but I knew I had to get the U.S. Attorney's Office and Public Defender's Office and all our judges interested in this. But because there was another program, and also Judge Paul Warner, I talked to him, and he was a first in the United States. So what I knew I had to do was persuade all the component parts. I was in favor of it. As I mentioned, I've always been a patriot for a bunch of reasons. And I learned from Judge Limbaugh that it works. I was surprised. And our pretrial services and probation officers saw that it worked because they went with me. So those components were complete. Then it was the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I was a former assistant United States attorney, and I was a first assistant and a criminal chief, and still have many friends there. So I approached them about this program and said, under no circumstances, I'm telling you to do this. I'm just telling you it's available. And from everything I've seen, it works. This program wouldn't exist without the Veterans Administration. We can all be happy and try to help them. It is vital that you have the Veterans Administration involved in the program. I was startled to find out how many programs there were effective programs for the Veterans Administration. It's important to understand that they're resistant to getting help. I mean, these are soldiers. So and I mean men and women, they don't ask for help. That's one of the most important things that I learned in the last 10 years is that I would find something in their pre-sentence report and I thought, why hasn't this ever been addressed? They don't ask for help. So, and that's another part of it too. In the resistance, you asked about resistance. There was no resistance from our court. It's the first time in all the years that I have been here where it was unanimous to create the Veterans Court. Mm-hmm. There are veterans and as our judges. And again, everybody's in favor of, even though they don't know exactly what they do, they're in favor of our military and our soldiers. It was critical that I present to our judges, because they had to approve it, that it was a very organized program. We weren't letting anybody off the hook. We were giving them help. If they violated, they violated. And they received whatever punishment was necessary for their violation. Give me a call. I'm very happy to help you. Just like Judge Limbaugh was happy to help me because we're believers, true believers. But it has to be organized. So you need the paper. You need to have dedicated people. You can't twist any arms. So as I mentioned, when I tell the new potential admittees, when they come to the first time to see if they really want to be in the program, I tell them, take a look around. We are all here for you. And yes, I am a judge. I have responsibility to uphold the law, but I want this to work for you. So, and I tell them, you'll never see the U.S. Attorney's Office and public defenders sitting on the same side. They're friendly. We're all here for you, and you have obligations without any question. But we are active in trying to assist you become productive members of society and move on. As a judge for 30 years, sentencing is always difficult because you really don't know if you're making a difference. It's easier to punish and to remove somebody from the public to make sure that they're not a danger to the community. But it's the requirement to look for rehabilitation that you don't really know if it will work. The Veterans Court is probably the most inspirational thing I've done as a judge. I've enjoyed my job very much. I enjoy the cases I've had and felt like I've done a service to the judiciary. But this, more than anything else, warms my heart. Our veterans are working for us, and this is the very little that we can do to work for them.
America's veterans are.
Professor Huskey, that was part of a much longer interview you did. What part of your time with Judge Silver left the greatest impression on you?
All of it. She's pretty amazing. I mean, she started, following the footsteps of Judge Limbaugh and Judge Warner in federal court. But I think there are really opportunities to expand Veterans Treatment Court in federal courts. And so when I got the chance to meet her and hear her story of how she started and why she started, and just sort of how meticulous she was about doing it, and it's successful. I just think, wow, there's opportunities here in some other federal courts, and it helps veterans.
Thank you very much. Chief Justice, you, Colonel Reyes, and I first met at the White House working on the Veterans Treatment Court Coordination Act of 2019. How have you seen that act promote the expansion of veteran treatment courts?
Well, the act itself says its purpose was to establish a single office within the Department of Justice that would provide grants, training, and technical assistance to help governments that were local, state, and tribal for them to establish and maintain veterans treatment courts in their jurisdiction. That act became law in 2020. Funding followed after that. And that whole process, that single office, is the Bureau of Justice Assistance within the Department of Justice.
And it sounds like it's worked. How many veteran treatment courts are now in the United States and its territories?
Well, I was going to say, if you don't want to listen to me, afterward, we have a handout available for people. And it is a printout, and it gives information. It's printed November 1st, 2023, but it actually is current through last December. And it indicates there are 537 VTCs in the country, and 61 of those have appeared in the 2 years before this was dated, so about 30 per year. And it's important to remember that we're talking about 56 possible entities that are represented here. That's the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and our 5 territories, such as Guam. And if you look at that list, it'll tell you that at that time, California led the states. They had 48 VTCs. Colonel Reyes' state of Florida had 32 VTCs. If you want information closer to Minnesota, then know that Ohio and Indiana had 29 VTCs each. Michigan had 28. There are 7 entities who had 0 VTCs at that time. Now, because this data is not quite a year old, Colonel Reyes and I have been advised that we're okay in telling people that there are approximately 600 VTCs in these judicial systems today. And as I said, We've got copies of this in the back if you want to take one home for a souvenir. If you want me to autograph it, it'll cost you money.
In your home state of Kansas, veteran treatment courts have grown quite a bit. Tell us about your efforts there.
Okay, our first VTC was created in 2016, and it was created in Johnson County, Kansas, which is our most populous county, about 600,000 people, and it is the part of the KC metro area. It took 5 more years before we got our second VTC. That's in Wyandotte County. It too is in the KC metro area. Now, at the time that these 2 VTCs were created, there was no VTC law in Kansas. So they were left to develop their own programs under the watchful eye of the Chief Justice of the Kansas Supreme Court. And we made sure that they were consistent with existing Kansas law. For you prosecutors, for example, they were not allowed to divert a defendant on a first-degree murder charge. Okay. So 3 more VTCs were created in Kansas in 2023. In fact, most recently, 3 days ago, I spoke at the opening ceremony for our latest VTC. So at present, we have 5 VTCs in Kansas. 4 of them were created in the last 2.5 years. We have 2 more who are awaiting word from the Bureau of Justice Assistance to see if their requests for grants have been accepted. I'm confident they will be, so that will give us a total of 7 VTCs in Kansas. And I forgot to mention earlier, the money that is in BJA under the act that we were involved in, that money is reserved exclusively for VTCs. So we're confident that we're going to get that funding.
Excellent. And what models are they using in these Kansas courts?
Well, the first law that was actually created by the Kansas legislature did not happen until about a year ago, that was devoted to any type of specialty court, much less veterans treatment courts. So, as I said, these 2 courts were left to develop their own. The law that finally was passed and became effective about a year ago was basically told the Kansas Supreme Court, establish rules for creating and supervising specialty courts, including VTCs. And so the Kansas Supreme Court wrote some very basic rules. And these VTCs since then have developed not their own program, but they followed the Johnson County model because it was there. And basically that model gives 3 paths for a defendant to graduate. There's pretrial diversion. There's also probation, which is post-plea, post-adjudication. There's something that I call post-imprisonment release. In other words, you've been released from prison, you're now in this program. And frankly, I think it's a pretty good model. In Johnson County, they've graduated 68 people, and they've had 3 people reoffend. So that's about a 5% rate. My friend Colonel Reyes will give you details later about the VTC he's involved in Tampa. They have many more graduates because they're a larger court, but we're pretty proud of that in Kansas.
Should be. And I know you've also become familiar with something called the Montana model. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I mentioned there are about 600 VTCs in our states, in our territories, and there are 12 veterans courts in the entire federal court system. And the Montana model basically is a combination of both of those. But very simply, it means that there is an agreement between the federal court in Montana and 2 state VTCs so that some of the federal defendants can get enrolled in the state VTC. They are there supervised by the state treatment team, by the state judge, and that state judge has authority to do some things about that defendant, can kick him out of the program if they're not cooperating. That judge has the authority to enroll them if they qualify under her measures, Different things can be done. The federal probation officer has the overall supervisory authority for that person. But one thing I want to make clear is that because those charges are filed in federal court, the jurisdiction stays with the federal court on those charges. And so the federal judge is the one who makes the final decision on the disposition of those charges, whether they do divert, whether they reduce the sentence or reduce the length of the probation. And the only thing that the state court can do on the sentence is make recommendations if this defendant has graduated from the program. And the federal judge can say, well, thank you for your recommendation, but the problem is this person had some other conditions of probation in our federal court. He's not satisfying, so I'm glad he graduated, but we're not going to reduce any sentence.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
If I could also say, I've been talking with some federal judges, the U.S. Attorney and others in Kansas, and they're very intrigued by this Montana model, and they are in the process of drafting a memorandum of understanding that they're going to give to the state VTC in Wichita, Kansas, and see if they can come to an agreement. So.
Sounds excellent. Colonel Reyes, you've built a mentor program down in Tampa that is nationally recognized. It's actually the only mentor program I've heard of outside of the state of Minnesota, so it's pretty impressive. Can you tell us about that building process and how that worked?
Yeah, I can. Thanks, Ryan. So when I retired in 2013, real quickly, like many veterans, I was looking for another mission. I was looking for purpose. I wanted to make a difference. After 33 years of serving active duty, you take off the uniform, and all of a sudden, you don't get the early morning call anymore. You don't have the morning formations. And so it was fortuitous. It was a late night, and I was watching an ABC 2020 special with my wife, and it was on this court called the Veterans Treatment Court down in Harris County, Texas. And I was mesmerized. The judge was a current, at that time, U.S. Army reservist, JAG officer, and then in his civilian job, he was, of course, the VTC judge. And he talked about all the things that we're talking about here. And it literally, I was spellbound. And I told my wife, I'm going to call one of my best friends in town, a lawyer, who's now one of our city councilmen, and he would know if we have this or if we can get it started. So I called him, and he set me up the next day for the judge, our first judge, who was at the cusp of writing the judicial administrative order to stand up the first Veterans Treatment Court in Hillsborough County, which is Tampa. It just so happened that that 20-minute interview that I had with him turned into 4 hours. But what was very important was in the middle of him talking to me about philosophies of treatment and rehabilitation and helping veterans, I looked at his credenza and I saw a very familiar certificate of appreciation. And it was signed by one of my old bosses in Balad, Iraq. A guy, at that time, he was a lieutenant general. His name was Stan McChrystal. Some of us know Stan McChrystal. And when I saw it, I went up and I looked at that certificate and I said, Judge, were you in Balad in 2007, 2008? And he said, yeah, I was. I said, so was I. What were you doing? And he said, well, I was a military magistrate. I was receiving all the detainees from M&D North, East, West, and South, and I was figuring out where to put them, whether I sent them to Abu Ghraib or Cropper, Camp Cropper, or if they were just sheep herders and Bedouins, then I would let them go. And I said, you received a lot of detainees every night from MND Baghdad. And he said, yes, I do. And I said, guess who's in charge of that operation? And he said, I don't know. I said, it was me. I said, you and me were there at the same time, serving for the same commander at Balad. And so this is what the judge said to me. He said, Colonel Reyes, I'm at the cusp of writing this judicial order. I don't have any money or a budget. I don't have any staff, and I certainly don't have any mentors. But I got this mission. I'm going to ask you, would you think about joining me in this cause to set up this Veterans Treatment Court? But before you answer, I want to just let you know, I can't pay you. And I thought about it for a long second, and I said, can I start tomorrow morning? And he said, are you sure? And I said, Judge, I didn't come here for a job. I came here for a cause. I came here for a mission. That was August 15th, 2013. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary. And following up on the judge's earlier comment, in the 10 years, we've graduated over 1,000 veterans. And we have around a 90% graduation rate and single-digit recidivism rate.
Wow. And how many mentors do you have now?
Right. So we started with one, me, in 2013. In 2019, when I saw you in D.C., we hit the apex. We had over 100 serving volunteer veteran mentors and a docket of over 225 defendants. Currently now, as a result of COVID and other challenges that we've had, not only in Florida but nationwide, we've leveled out a little bit. This morning I called the court because they had a VTC today. We currently have 72 defendants and we have 56 mentors serving.
Wow, that's great. And how do you see the mentors supporting the veterans as they go through the court?
Right, so that's all part and parcel with our qualification and training program that I put together over the years. But basically, the training involves not only knowledge of the court system, all the players, and what everybody has to do when they're playing their part. It also involves understanding the contract, the VTC contract that the veteran signs, because they are levied with a lot of mandated court requirements. But also we train them on the Community Resource Network. Now these are the community, and you need the community to support you on it, to be honest, because without the community, you're not gonna have the resources to help the veterans. Let me just say, over the 10 years that I've been doing this, there are 5 major areas that veterans in the Veterans Treatment Court will bring to them as problems or challenges in the court. And they are low-cost, affordable housing, viable employment, education, and I'm not talking about a college degree, I'm talking about licenses and certifications so they can immediately get to work, especially in the trade skills. Affordable, reliable transportation, and food insecurity. I see this all the time, every day. It's a cocktail mix. You never see one, you see 3 or more altogether. And so we train our mentors to be sensitive to that, as well as to be an encourager for all of our veterans going through the court, and to help them as a navigator, to help them navigate through the court system and through the resource network.
What characteristics make up the ideal mentor for you?
So we have a couple mandatory, in Florida, a couple mandatory requirements. One, by Florida law, you have to have veteran status if you're a veteran. And if you come in as a veteran, as a candidate, then you have to have an honorable discharge. That's our policy. Or you can be like me, retired status from the military, or you can be active duty serving. Many of you know that Tampa is home of the U.S. Central Command and U.S. Special Operations Command. We have the #1 veteran populated county in our 67 counties in the state. That's for the mandatory requirements. There's other things that I do look at. Not mandatory, but they help, they're value added. One, I tend to look for more senior type mentors, okay? It goes to reason that the more senior you are and more senior you have spent in the military, chances are you've commanded troops or you've led troops, whether you're an enlisted, NCO, or you're an officer. So that really helps, especially when you're mentoring a veteran in need. Combat experience, it is not mandatory. However, we've been at war for the last 2 decades, and the more candidates we're getting in, most of them have combat experience of one sort or another. So that's very helpful because many of the defendants that we have come in have combat experience as well. A common question that I'm asked is, hey, do you accept any graduates as mentors? And the answer is yes. It's far and few in between. However, we have identified a handful over the 10 years of mentors that graduated, but they demonstrated that leadership and the purpose needed to be a good mentor. So we actually have some graduates that are now peer mentors. And then finally, some of the other additional qualities I look at is, are you a good active listener? Because you have to listen to these veterans. Veterans are going to talk, and they're going to tell you their story. You have to show compassion, but at the same time, you have to be able to hold a veteran accountable. And then finally, we look for problem solvers, because there's no black and white in any of these situations or scenarios that these veterans find themselves in. It's always a shade of gray. So we're always looking for mentors that can think on their feet, but have a good baseline of common sense, integrity, and as I said, compassion.
Thank you. We heard Chief Justice and Judge Silver talk about the federal veterans courts. I know you've done some work with the Middle District of Florida Federal Court. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, so real quickly, early last year, I was contacted by one of the U.S. Federal District Court judges in the Middle District of Florida, the Tampa courthouse, and he said to me, he said, "Hey, Colonel Reyes, I have an OIF, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Army Combat PTSD veteran. He's brought up on death charges against one of our VA centers, medical centers. So he's under my jurisdiction, but I don't want to throw him in prison. That's not going to help him. But I know all about your Veterans Treatment Court and your high success. Is there a way you can come to court, tell us about your court, and see perhaps you would entertain mentoring him and availing him to the resources of your state level VTC?" And I said, absolutely. Okay, so that was early last year, 2022. Fast forward 14 months. I mentored this veteran. I got him all of the resources: housing, employment, education, a service dog, a vehicle we donated from my 501c3 that our mentors run, and I had him do community service with me. We supported the EFMP program on the base. That's special needs kids of military families, and we also did equine therapy, horse rescue. Really worked. So this past May, I went before the judge in the federal district court, the sentencing, and he asked me, give the court an appraisal or an assessment of how the veteran did. So I laid it all out. And basically it was transformational in a positive way. Here's what the judge said. He said, you know, I can impose imprisonment on you, but because you have demonstrated a transformational change based on the Veterans Treatment Court, I'm going to impose 2 consecutive probation sentences. And I'm going to ask Colonel Reyes, if he would, to volunteer an additional year to mentor you. And if you come back to me a year later, which is going to be next May, next year, and you're on glide path and you're doing everything you're doing now, I will favorably consider dismissing the probation charges. So because of that, it was a big win for us, but more importantly, I took that and I presented it to the U.S. Attorney's Office at the Middle District of Florida and to the Chief Judge, who, by the way, was a classmate of mine at Notre Dame. I found this out as I was talking to him, and I said to both gentlemen, this is our pilot program. This is what we need to do. So we are in the middle of that coordination right now of trying to work out the mechanics of trying to set that up.
Excellent. Well, I thank all 3 of you very much. I could sit up here and talk to you all day, but I think we're out of time.
Can I mention something in 10 seconds? The money I talked about under this act that started being provided each year since August of 2020, last year, $35 million was appropriated by Congress. $8 million of that money was left on the table because not enough entities around this country applied for federal grants for VTC. So let me simply say, I urge you to apply for that money. Don't leave a nickel on that table. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief.
Afternoon, I'm Hank Shea. I'm a vice chair of the Veterans Defense Project Board, and I also teach here at the University of St. Thomas. We're now going to hear a video. Former Secretary of Defense and former Senator Chuck Hagel from Nebraska wanted to be here today, but he is the chair of the Veterans Justice Commission, which you're going to hear more about in just a few minutes. So he had other obligations, but he wanted to make sure that we all knew how much he cared about what we're doing here today. So we're going to listen to this video message for those here and online, and then we will have our panel on the second issue about what the Veterans Justice Commission is all about, but we'll hear from Senator Hagel.
veterans are in trouble. While most veterans return home and successfully reintegrate back into their communities, 1 in 3 reports being arrested and jailed at least once in their lifetimes, often as a result of PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and related substance abuse. Today, more than 181,000 veterans are behind bars in America, making up nearly 8% of those in our state prisons and 5% of our federal prison population. While I'm deeply troubled by those statistics, and we all are, I'm not surprised. My brother Tom and I served together as enlisted infantrymen in Vietnam in 1968. We experienced the horrors of combat and the painful aftermath. Many of our friends and fellow veterans brought their wars home with them and were engulfed in a decades-long wave of fatal overdoses, broken marriages, failed careers, suicides, and unfortunately, contact with the criminal justice system. Following our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the longest conflicts in our country's history, we are now turning to reintegrating this new generation of veterans, the most heavily deployed in our history. Veterans of these modern conflicts fought long, simultaneous wars without a draft, often serving multiple deployments, like no generation of veterans before them. Research confirms that they are suffering from historically high rates of PTSD and other invisible injuries, and are falling into the criminal justice system at high rates as well. As a veteran, a former deputy administrator of the Veterans Administration, and a former Secretary of Defense, I have long wrestled with the questions of what causes veterans to fall into the criminal justice system, and how can we better support them. To that end, last year, I joined with the Council on Criminal Justice to launch the Veterans Justice Commission. The goal of the commission is to explore these issues in depth, consulting with our nation's top experts in psychology, sociology, medicine, the military, and the law, and then to recommend policy changes to support at-risk veterans better, and in turn, better protect public safety. The commission is approximately midway through our 3-year mission, exploring ways to improve service members' transition back into civilian life in order to avoid contact with the justice system, ways to improve the justice system's approach with those who do, and finally, ways to better transition veterans who go to prison back into their communities, and exploring ways to improve our response to veterans who fall into the system. The Justice Commission has explored a variety of current approaches, including veterans treatment courts, diversion programs, and statutory tools, including a recently passed law in Minnesota. We recruited Brock Hunter and Ryan Else, co-founders of the Veterans Defense Project, who have long advocated for their fellow veterans in the justice system and who helped draft and lead passage of Minnesota's legislation to serve as advisors to this commission. They work together with other experts from across the country to craft a model policy as well. That model policy, embodied in the Veterans Justice Act, provides an array of intervention options for veterans across a wide range of criminal offenses, from a diversion program for low-level offenses, more intensive interventions for mid-level offenses, and sentencing mitigation for more serious offenses, with the goal of using each veteran's contact with the justice system as an intervention opportunity, holding them accountable and ensuring they receive needed care, thereby better protecting public safety while also providing them with a path to redemption and true reintegration back into the communities they served and sacrificed to protect. The Veterans Defense Project will be playing a key role in the years ahead, helping to spread the word about the Veterans Justice Act. The Veterans Justice Commission thanks the Veterans Defense Project and all those who care for our justice-involved veterans. Together, we can bring them the rest of the way home. Thank you very much.
So for our panel, Brock Hunter, to my right, your left, is a co-founder of the Veterans Defense Project. He was an Army Recon Scout, and he now serves as a private criminal defense attorney here in Minneapolis. To my left, your right, Colonel Jim Seward is a veteran of Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, a former enlisted combat armed soldier. He now serves as the executive director of the Veterans Justice Commission. And Brock, let's start with you. And tell us about how you got involved in the Veterans Justice Commission and then got much more involved.
Sure. Thanks, Hank. Well, over the last 15 years or so that Ryan Nelson and I have been working in this area, we've formed some strong relationships with stakeholders around the country that work in this area, and many of whom have ultimately become involved in this commission. But we got a call a couple of years ago as the commission was just getting off the ground from Jim Seward and Adam Gelb, who heads up the Council on Criminal Justice that is sponsoring this project, and ultimately was invited to come and present to the commission. Secretary Hegel and a lot of other influential people, no stress at all in that presentation. To present about the Minnesota Veterans Restorative Justice Act and the work that we have been doing here in Minnesota. And then ultimately we were recruited on to serve as advisors, as Secretary Hagel mentioned, on the commission, ultimately helping form a working group of folks from across the country that put together this model policy that ultimately became the Veterans Justice Act.
So, Jim, you had a lot of invitations for today. Let's put you on the spot by telling us, why did you choose to come to Minneapolis this week in particular?
Free Viking tickets. Except I'm still looking for them. Brock and Ryan have been an integral part of the work that we have done, and you just heard from the chair. You might be wondering, what would I do as director of the Veterans Justice Commission when I have such an amazing chair? I have worked on state policy issues for many, many years, which is how I got to become acquainted with Adam Gelb, the CEO of the think tank, and why I ended up on the board of directors. And I was peacefully on the board of directors when Adam Gelb called me during the pandemic and said, "Retired 4-star General Peter Carelli wants to talk to you. He has a lot of questions about veterans in the justice system, and I can't answer them, and he wants our think tank to do some work on them. Since you're vice chair of the board, will you talk to him?" And I did, and that's how we launched this. And when I found this Rapid City, South Dakota gent that grew up about 50 miles away from me and graduated from high school just maybe a year before me, although he looks much younger than I do. Maybe he graduated at 12. But when I got to know Brock and Ryan, I said, if they need me in Minneapolis, I'm going to Minneapolis.
So typically when Jim speaks around the country now, he has been given anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes to present what we're now going to try and do in a much shorter period of time. But Jim, why don't we start with how the Veterans Justice Commission got created, its membership, and I know you have a few PowerPoint slides, and we're gonna slide through those.
I will slide through them quickly, Professor, as I look at the clock. Well, as I said, General Carelli was persistent. He's a trustee at the council, and when you talk to Secretary Hegel, he'll say things like, "Jim, you go first. You're a colonel. I was just a sergeant." Well, when I talked to General Carelli, I remember my days as being a sergeant, and my knees shake, and he can hear it when I talk to him. I love veterans treatment courts. In 2012, when I was drafting the legislation in South Dakota for Governor Dugard to reform the adult criminal justice system, I included 2 pilot programs for veterans treatment courts. General Carelli kept asking me, if veterans treatment courts are the silver bullet in America for veterans, why do we still have so many veterans going into the justice system every day across our country? I could not answer. And for the veterans like Colonel Reyes, when a 4-star general's asking you a question and you don't know the answer, you have to do some research. I researched, but I also reached out to brilliant people across the country. We began building the commission. Adam told me I had a little task of raising $4 million to get started, and I'm about 90% there. I'm still trying to rake in last few 100,000 in case there's anybody in the audience that hasn't finished their year-end giving and is maxed out to Brock. But we were able to put this fine group together, and there are amazing folks here. You can't read all their names, but we have a Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps. You want to talk about scary. We have Ron Self, who spent 26 years in San Quentin after he was a Marine, and now he has a PhD and runs a program for veterans. Many other folks, one of the top researchers in the country that works for the VA. I could go on for hours about these. Leon Panetta, 84 or 85, and the sharpest person I have ever met. Let's go to the next slide so I don't get slapped by the professor. The commission is focusing on 3 sectors of work. We're going to talk about the Veterans Justice Act tonight. It's what came from one of the recommendations in the commission's first report. But because of General Carelli, we're not just looking at the U.S. justice system and its 3,600 counties and 18,000 police departments and 3,600 prosecutors and 600 veterans treatment courts. We're looking at the transition system from the military, the VA, the Department of Labor, what happens in and what does not happen in the Department of Defense as a service member is coming out. And then we're also looking at the back end of the criminal justice system, or what we call corrections and reentry. The commission did the front end of the criminal justice system last year, published a report in March, has 3 recommendations. I'll talk about those in a second. This year they're focused on transition. What an enormous monster to study the Department of Defense. If this is non-attribution, I will just say when we started this section, I said, well, the Department of Defense has been reforming me for 37 years. Maybe it's my turn. That won't be an easy task. But we'll have some great recommendations coming out from the commission soon on that. I could talk about what we know for hours, but we know we have about 200,000 veterans sitting in prisons and jails across the country, and that's based on old data, based on surveys. The first report came out in March. There's 3 recommendations. The first one deals with identification of veterans and definition of veterans. You would think in 2023 we could define what a veteran is. There's about 100 definitions of what a veteran is in the United States today. The commission recommended 1 definition for justice-involved veterans, and it's being considered and worked on by congressional staff right now. In the identification realm, there's a database that the VA has available to law enforcement so they can identify veterans when they come into the system. 9 law enforcement agencies in the country are using that database, and remember I said there are over 18,000. We're working with Congress and the VA to try to improve that. Recommendation number 2 is, you can see in the action, the Veterans Justice Act. We built an amazing committee. I think pictures of that committee might be next. On the next slide, the Model Policy Framework Committee. So in March, the commission said, yes, this is our recommendation. We need alternative sentencing, because while veterans courts are amazing and they're a very favorable development, and we wish they were in every jurisdiction in the country, and we wish they were uniform, and we wish they all had federal funding or state funding, we don't have that. And they focus on high risk and high need, but there are many other folks that are falling through the cracks. 86% of our counties in America do not have a veterans treatment court. Almost half of them don't allow someone with a violent felony. You'll meet Hector in a little bit in a 60-second video. When you see that video, think about the Veterans Justice Act. Hector would not get into most veterans treatment courts in America. My dream would be that if eventually every state would pass the Veterans Justice Act and every county would have a veterans treatment court, and then almost no one would fall through the cracks. Next slide. Can we go back to the previous slide, because I want to point out for the folks in the audience, Brock Hunter, who's pictured here on this slide, John Choi, Ryan Else, and of course, folks from VDP, but I also wanted to mention Evan Simone. Many of you in the audience know Evan. Evan was a dear, dear friend. He was one of my advisors from the very beginning of this commission. If you know Evan, you know that Evan and I talked night and day and on the weekends and Saturday mornings at 6 a.m. when he finished another policy brief for me. Evan was a legend, and Evan passed away this summer as I was in Orlando getting the model policy framework adopted. And when I think of the Veterans Justice Act, I think of Evan Simone.
A week before his death, I exchanged emails with him and invited him to this event. He's here, just in a different way. Brock, why don't you say a few words?
Well, yeah, we lost one of our own during this mission, and he was definitely one of our MVPs. Evan is probably, will be for the rest of our lifetimes, the most prolific publisher of law review articles, books, and other research papers related to veterans in the justice system. He was a contributor to our book, Defending Veterans in Criminal Court, a decade ago, and a close friend of ours, and he just simply won't be replaced.
Jim, back to you.
Thank you, sir. So here's the summary of the Veterans Justice Act. When you see Hector's video, there'll be a phone number at the end of it, and while standard messaging charges apply, most carriers, if you text to that number what it tells you to do, you'll go to a link and you can read the alternative sentencing report on the Veterans Justice Act. There is a long, very wonky report that will tell you about this report. If you're into evidence-based practices, you will learn more about evidence-based practices than you ever want to learn. But just like veterans treatment courts are based in evidence, the Veterans Justice Act is based in evidence. The key to both of them is following the rules, right? And our hope is that states will pass the Veterans Justice Act, giving every judge in every state the authority to recognize veteran status and to deal with veterans in a better way. Next slide. Brock, do you want to talk at all about the Veterans Justice Act while we're here before we jump to the next one?
We can now, or we can come back to it.
Okay, I'll finish. All right. So the third recommendation from the commission, and this is still on the front end of the criminal justice system, and we have transition and the back end coming out soon, but the third recommendation is to create a national center for veterans justice. There are a lot of statistics when we talk about veterans, and you probably know that 47% of all statistics are made up. The latest I've seen is 66,000 organizations in the United States are serving veterans, public and private. We have the greatest country in the world. 72% of voters in the United States, according to a recent Pew poll, said, we want to spend more money on veterans. We have an amazing country. But most of these programs, most of these nonprofits, little nonprofits in northwestern South Carolina or nonprofits in San Diego, most of them are working in a silo. They may be employing best practices, but they don't know it. They don't have the staff to put their data into a database and get researchers to evaluate their program, to prove that they're evidence-based, so they can ask Chief Justice Nuss to go to the Hill and get more funding from the Bureau of Justice Assistance. There is no data clearinghouse. There is no clearinghouse for best practices. That's one of the things that the National Center for Veterans Justice will do, and we're working with leaders on the Hill on that very task right now. Next slide. The Transition Advisory Committee, also made up of folks in the room that, like Hector and Chief Justice Nuss, that you will recognize, as well as many, many other amazing folks that have been practitioners. For the warfighters in the room, you'll recognize Colonel Bill Oslin, commanded the most highly decorated unit in our nation's last 2 generation-long wars. And is that my last slide? I think so. Let's say yes.
So
Thank you.
let's shift back to you, Brock, and you and Ryan and the members of the VDP, some state legislators who are here, some who are watching, put a tremendous amount of effort into getting the Veterans Restorative Justice Act enacted into law in Minnesota. We now have this for every judge in every county in our state. Now you've created this model, this Veterans Justice Act, to bring to other states. What's the relationship between the two, and why are you so enthusiastic about the end product that your policy group has put together?
Sure. Well, to start with the Minnesota Act, we started working on the Minnesota Act in 2017 when the state public defenders pulled out of our state's veterans courts because of the disparity in models amongst the various courts. Lots of different criteria regarding what types of offenses they would take. Some would only take felonies, some wouldn't take any felonies. Some would give their veterans an opportunity to avoid a conviction if they did everything expected, and some of them would convict the veteran of their offense even if they did everything right. And so that was a 3-alarm fire for Ryan and I because of our vision of wanting to see some kind of veterans program in every county in Minnesota. And without the public defender system in support, that was just never going to happen. So we put together a working group here in Minnesota to try to figure out how we could fix this situation, and came up with the Veterans Restorative Justice Act that provides some uniform criteria regarding the types of offenses that a veteran would be eligible for therapeutic justice, and what types of legal incentives, what kind of benefit they would get if they did what we were asking of them. And it doesn't just apply to our existing veterans courts in Minnesota. It applies to them. It doesn't interfere with their day-to-day operations, but it provides uniformity as far as the types of offenses that are eligible, the types of legal incentives. But it also provides individual judges in the majority of Minnesota counties that don't have a veterans treatment court with a toolbox of tools to basically create a veterans court, one veteran at a time, as these veterans appear before them. Our hope is that over time, as more veterans are identified and coming under supervision in these small counties, that they'll decide to create a veterans treatment court as an economy of scale. But in the meantime, no veteran is going to be left behind in Minnesota if they meet the criteria for the statute. The Veterans Justice Act takes all of those principles and puts them into play. Again, providing uniform types of offenses with uniform types of legal incentives. But it goes even further than what we have here in Minnesota. It has what I think is a better and a little bit less restrictive criteria regarding a connection between military service and the charged offense. It provides for data collection, which we think is vital. We've got to start collecting more numbers about the veterans coming through the system and the kinds of outcomes that we're getting so that we can improve over the next several years. And it provides for a lot of training as well. Judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, probation officers, law enforcement, all need to understand better what drives veterans into the justice system and how we can all do a better job this time around. So for us, the Veterans Justice Act it embodies the Minnesota statute, but it even improves on it in many ways.
Okay. So Jim, I had you cut your PowerPoint so much that I think we've got a few extra minutes here. What do you want to share with this audience, particularly the people online who are from coast to coast here today, about why are you doing this and why is this work so important for our country to be more focused on?
Thank you, Hank. I grew up in western South Dakota. My dad was a mechanic. My mom was a secretary. There's absolutely no reason, as one of the colonels I served with in Afghanistan said, Jim, how did they find some nobody in the middle of nowhere, South Dakota, to lead a national commission on veterans in the justice system? And I said, I have no idea. I have no idea, but I am passionate about justice. That's why I went and got a law degree. I served on the East-West German border when Ronald Reagan was president, and I was a private, and I used to argue with my lieutenants until they would make me go clean the latrine or get off the border. And my sergeants drove me to go to school, drove me to go to law school. They said, you have got to do it. And I was practicing law in Wyoming, literally representing coal mines and gold mines, when Adam Gelb called me and said, would you consider leaving your law firm and running this commission? And I said, for veterans? An issue that cuts across the hyper-partisan craziness of our country today? Absolutely. And then I said, I'm leaving my law firm. Does that position pay? And he said, public service rate. I said, perfect. As long as I can pay the light bill, we're good to go. But I have found no higher calling in my entire life than public service, and I have enjoyed it every step along the way. And I know that the good Lord blessed me with an ability to look at a system and get brilliant people like Dr. Aaron Rosenthal, a Minneapolis native who's on our team, to get those folks in the room and try to digest what it is that they've spent their life researching, visit with the people that work in the system, look at the data and the research, and work with a team to collaborate to come up with policy solutions. I look at what we've done in this nation. We've done amazing things. But if you look at the World War II population and a study that was published in 1952, if you have Brock and Ryan's book, it's in there. 1952, when they looked at the population in the late 40s in 11 prisons in the upper Midwest, they determined that a third of the prisoners were veterans. That was America's greatest generation. And I'm not saying anything bad about them. I'm saying they brought home invisible wounds. I'm afraid that in the United States, the curve of veterans in the justice system, if we do nothing, and thank goodness for veterans treatment courts, that's helping us, but we need to find more ways to bend that curve down. And if we can do it on the front end with transition. Professor Huskey said something that really struck a nerve with me, and she's right. Once a Marine, always a Marine, right? Unless you're a first-term enlisted Marine that has deployed once, twice, 5 times in your first term, and you're kicked out with an other than honorable discharge, then you're a dirtbag, and you go home with shame, and you're told you're not a Marine, and the VA tells you you're not a veteran, and we can't figure out in this nation why some veterans are deciding to end their own lives. We're working with Duke University and America's Warrior Partnership on what I believe is groundbreaking research that shows if you're a first-term enlisted soldier, Marine, service member in the United States, but first-term enlisted person who gets removed from the military during that first term involuntarily for any reason, medical, military misconduct, you are 68% more likely to take your own life. 68% more likely. We're working with them to overlay criminal justice data on their data so that we can help find intervention points for veterans. So we know if I'm a veteran and I'm arrested, that might be an intervention point for a targeted suicide prevention program. Dr. Rosenthal would tell you that we've been researching suicide and veterans in this country for a long time, and experts from Harvard to USC don't know if criminal justice is a factor. But imagine being that young Marine from Tennessee whose grandpa and dad were Marines and comes home with an other than honorable discharge. That's why.
Brock, final comments.
Sure. Well, I think it bears saying here as we talk about veterans in the justice system that most veterans come home from their service stronger and wiser and immediate assets to their communities. But some, and a significant percentage have always brought their war home with them in the form of invisible injuries we today call post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, and other conditions that, if untreated, very often lead them into the criminal justice system. And I guess what I would leave you with is that when given a proper opportunity, couched with accountability and the proper kind of treatment, even veterans who committed some pretty serious offenses are redeemable, can get the help they need, and can be not just assets, but super assets to the communities that they risk their lives to protect. And that is what the Minnesota Veterans Restorative Justice Act is about, and what the National Veterans Justice Act is about. And I think we're about to watch a short video about one of our next panelists.
You want to introduce the video, and then the other panel will be coming up as you introduce the video.
Okay. Well, it's really an honor to be here tonight with you. We've got one of Brock's good friends and one of our good friends at the Veterans Justice Commission, Hector Medicastillo. Hector, many of you probably know Hector, and you're going to get to know Hector a lot better because not only is he on the next video, but he is on the next panel. And if you're at the game Sunday, you'll get to see Hector as he's honored by the Minnesota Vikings. As we started to look at the Veterans Justice Act last January, February, March, I'm already thinking 6, 8 months, a year ahead of time when I'm going to have to be in front of the national attorney generals and the national governors and the legislative bodies of our country, and I'm thinking about how am I going to tell the story about why we need the Veterans Justice Act. We already have some veterans treatment courts. How are we going to get them to understand the gap? Watch Hector's 60-second video, please, and thanks, Hector, for being here tonight. Here he is.
Year veteran of the United States Army. I received the Bronze Star during Operation Iraqi Freedom. One of the most difficult things I've ever had to do is transition to civilian life. When I was raised, PTSD was a 4-letter cuss word. We don't deal with it well. I ended up with my 2 revolvers in my hands, facing off with 8 police officers. In my mind, I was on an operation. I thought I was gonna die. Then I thought, but why would I wanna live? The judge heard about my military history, looked at me and said, young man, you must exercise your demons. And I'm letting you go and get the help that you need. And it worked. I was recruited to become a crisis negotiator. I'm gonna be a clinical psychologist. I've raised 5 boys. If it wasn't for that second chance, I wouldn't have those boys. Maybe we could do something better with veterans that will become a national model. If we do this right with this population, we could do this right with everyone.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chitra Raghavan, and I'll be moderating the last panel of the evening, which is called Addressing Invisible Injuries and the Epidemic of Veteran Suicides. And I have 3 absolutely incredible guests today to talk about the impact of suicide on veterans, their families, and U.S. institutions, and what these institutions are trying to do to kind of reduce the gaps in the system to get rid of some of these numbers, which are pretty astonishing, as you all know. So joining me now are Hector Medicastillo,
Thank you.
Who you saw in the video, Travis Kowitz. Hector is an Army veteran and a therapist. Travis is the founder of the nonprofit Bill's Wish. He's a defense attorney and VDP board member, and I should note a St. Thomas Law School grad, much like our very own Ryan Eltz, who's the co-founder of the VDP. And also joining me is Dan Tengwall. He's a U.S. Army veteran and local Veterans Affairs lead for intervention. Hector, that encounter that you described in the video, where you were surrounded by 8 heavily armed cops, that came after 12 deployments around the world, and as the judge put it, more demons than you could handle. Can you describe, you had gotten into a fight with your ex-wife, the cops were called. What was your mental state when they arrived on the scene?
And what they found was I was dissociative. I thought that I was in a different country. I was even speaking in the languages that I knew how to tell somebody to to stop. I thought that I was facing off with one individual, and I was yelling commands at him while he yelled commands at me. I was in a T-shirt, I was in jeans, and if you know anything about January 24th in Minnesota, it's cold. And I had 2 revolvers in my hands, and then I came out of it and realized I'm surrounded by police officers, and I wasn't expecting myself to be out there.
And you told me that when you subsequently came out of it, you believed that you essentially had a wish to potentially get into an armed encounter and end your life.
Yes. Yeah, I started thinking at that point, there won't be a flag across my casket when I die. I've just dishonored my creed, the Ranger Creed, the NCO Creed, all the values that I have stood for as a soldier. And I started thinking, then what's the point of living? And I don't want to live like this anymore anyway.
But you didn't do it. Why?
Part of it was realizing that my son might have been watching, and I thought, I don't want him to have to live with that. I haven't seen that. And the other part of it was thinking that maybe I could get through this thing, and it was better to live than to have my son bury me.
You know, you were very lucky because a number of factors worked together to save your life and your future, right? The first thing was that the cops knew that they were responding to a veteran in crisis. Right. There was a veteran cop there. So they were very judicious in how they handled your situation.
Right.
You didn't pull the trigger, which was the most important thing. You didn't provoke them beyond the state that you were in.
Correct.
The judge could have put you away for a very long time, but he didn't. He used his bench authority.
Yes.
He saw your distinguished record, and he ordered you into therapy.
Right.
So many different things happened, and the police officers who confronted you that night didn't even show up at your sentencing, and 2 of them asked that you be invited to join the SWAT crisis monitoring team, correct?
Yep.
So there were just so many different factors. That was your turning point.
Right.
How did you use that to start to give back to other veterans who are in crisis?
Well, as you just heard, I mean, you can't put all those things together. It's not a coincidence, and it's also an amazing second chance. I was given the deal of a lifetime, and I didn't want to go out with the thought that this is the kind of person I am, as the colonel said, like a dirtbag, or I'm a criminal. And as I started getting help, I began to realize that I can give back. In fact, I was meeting with Brock, asking to get my record expunged, when he said, "Nah, man, you got to tell the story." And I didn't even think about it, and to realize that I could give back and become a social worker, become a mental health provider. The battle continues to get warriors out of those ditches, out of those dungeons, out of their basements, and get them to want to stay alive. A new mission was given to me. And I wanted that to be a good second chance, and I made good on that.
And it must be noted that your resolve was such that you came out of that crisis and actually went back for a 13th deployment, your final one.
Right. Uncle Sugar thought that I could deploy one more time, so they sent me as a first sergeant in charge of a rifle company. And we got at the company level, the Congressional Meritorious Unit Citation. All 167 downrange came back during the Al Lombard province's, surge. So it was amazing, yeah. And then I was out. I was done.
And you're a therapist today?
I am a therapist. I am currently completing my proposal in my dissertation, which is chapters 2 and 3. And I hope to have that done by the first quarter of next year.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you.
Travis.
Yes.
Hector was lucky. He lived to tell his story. But your father, Bill Kovitz, was not so lucky. And could you tell us what happened with your father?
Yeah, so I'm the oldest of 4 boys. I was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in my junior year, and I got a phone call from the Anoka County Sheriff's Department on an idle Tuesday afternoon, letting me know that my father had committed suicide via a single gunshot wound to the head. And that just completely changed my life, of course, for many reasons. I mean, one, the National Sports Center. I'm from Blaine, Minnesota. I played hockey and soccer along with all my brothers. That's a time where my father coached me there. So there was a lot of warm memories. I also had worked there in the summers that I'd come home from the University of Wisconsin and stay at my house. So it was just a very difficult situation at that point.
Hector told us about his story at an individual level. You're not yourself a veteran, but you saw this crisis unfold from a familial level, a societal level, where there's a cascading effect on the people around you. You were a junior in college, and you had the very difficult task of breaking the news to your 12-year-old brother, your siblings. Tell us what happened in the coming months, how you tried to deal with it and to comfort your family.
Well, yeah, I immediately felt like I had to step into a fatherly role to my younger brothers and be strong and show strength to the community that had a lot of questions, similar questions that I had in my mind at that point. So I just try to project some stoic, strong emotions, I guess, for everyone else, and certainly I was struggling within. I did go back to school, and with all the different emotions, the roller coaster of questions as to why, and the grief, and the anger, and the pride, and the loss, I succumbed to mental health issues and chemical dependency issues very quickly thereafter as I was masking being okay when I wasn't okay.
And you had suicidal thoughts yourself. You were in a series of, you were trying to find a solution through a number of therapists, and it didn't work until you found one therapist. His name was Brad. What advice did he give you that led to that paradigm shift that allowed you to pull yourself out of this?
Yeah, I mean, the school connected me to therapists while I was at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I had gone to a number of different individuals, and for one reason or another, they just didn't work out. I ended up walking out of the room and not going back. But when I found this individual by the name of Brad, he had listened to my story, and I wanted something that I could do. There was a lot of listening going on, but there wasn't a lot of homework given to me to try to improve my own situation. And he said, Travis, I've been listening here, and every time you come in, it seems like, you're struggling with all these things, but you have a lot of good things going on in your life. Why don't you try doing this? Try starting every morning with gratitude prayers. Just say 3 things when you're shaving in the morning of things that you're thankful for and that you're lucky to have, and see if that starts your day off just in a different way, and it certainly did.
And once you recovered from your grief, one never does recover from your grief, but you came out of it enough to do something incredible for other veterans and their families, and that was to create your nonprofit, Bill's Wish, named after your father and named after the song that he asked you and your brothers to listen to the week before he died. Could you tell us a little bit about the song and your foundation and what you're trying to do?
Yeah, so a week before my father had committed suicide, he had reached out to me and all 3 of my brothers asking us to listen to a new country music song by Rascal Flatts called My Wish. Very enthusiastic about it, which was, just seemed a little bit odd at the time. But the song basically is about giving more than you take and helping out others. And so I wanted to turn this situation into something positive. I wanted to try to help one individual not have to experience what me and my family had to deal with. And so we started Bill's Wish. The goal is to assist the VA by providing subsidized chemical health and mental health treatment to veterans. We are currently the only chemical dependency treatment patient aid with Hazelton Betty Ford. We've donated over $60,000 to them so far.
And what are some of the other kinds of things you're doing in terms of helping veterans who are in trouble?
Yeah, so we've provided legal advocacy. We've There's been a lot of talk about Veterans Treatment Court and funding. There was one regional court in Pine, Isani, Kanabec, and Chisago County that wanted to get started. The public defenders had backed out and they didn't have any funding, so we stepped up and provided criminal defense representation for them. We had 5 individuals who ended up getting through that program, all of which successfully. We did surveys for those individuals on, what we could do from Bill's wish, because a lot of us weren't veterans ourselves. We were serving those who've served us. And they indicated some barriers of entry to the VA and how they would like to have, paid for privatized health care and chemical dependency treatment, so we did that. Transportation was an issue, so we started a Wheels for Warriors project where we took in donated vehicles, fixed them up, did safety checks, and donated them to veterans in need of a vehicle to get back on their feet and have a job and be self-sufficient. And so those are just some of the things that we've done.
And how are you doing today, and how is your family doing?
I'm doing great. I graduated from here, so that's good. But yeah, Bill's Wish is doing awesome. We're in our 3rd year. We have an annual 5K walk run at Moberg Park in Chisago City at the Veterans Memorial on Veteran Suicide Awareness Day, which is the first Saturday in October every year. To date, we've raised over $115,000 and donated over 6 cars. And again, we have the only veteran patient aid at Hazel and Betty Ford.
That's great. Well, I know this is not an easy story to share, so we're grateful that you shared it with us today.
No problem.
And Dan, you are an 18-year veteran of the Minnesota National Guard, and like Hector, you're also a combat veteran deployed 2009 to Iraq. You come back from Iraq, and you realize something's not quite right. Your brother notices as well. Tell me about what happened when you came back from that combat deployment. What were you seeing your brother was seeing in you?
Yeah, it was more, I think, my brother Tony saw it than I saw it, and nobody wants to listen to their older brother, right? Especially when they're right. But coming back, I probably had a lot of the same factors that you see in some traditional veterans coming back, withdrawing from things, not being as interested in stuff I used to be, quick to anger. I did get kicked out of the Sam's Club in Bloomington. And I wasn't familiar with their policy of checking receipts. So I had a little bit of problem there, and that was maybe the thing that most pushed me toward the VA and getting care.
A Sam's Club crisis.
A Sam's Club crisis.
You just can never predict.
I'm a Costco guy.
Right on.
So, and your brother recognized it because he himself had served.
Yes, he had deployed 4 years earlier, much tougher deployment, and I think, without me really realizing, he had gone through his own stuff and really dealt with it himself. Still deals with it, but thankfully I had him. He's willing to say, I'm willing to say he's a stronger guy than I am, and so I'm really thankful to have Tony in my life.
So what did he advise you to do?
Yeah, I think everything but taking me by the collar and throwing me in the VA. Similar to what you just shared, Travis, mental health is not a one and done. It's not a simple thing. It's a really complex process. So I think I went through like 3 or 4 therapists before I really found somebody that I clicked with. It was a lot of asking questions. It was a lot of talking to other veterans, whether that they had served long ago or that I had served with, and just trying to be more open about what is available, what can we get for benefits and services.
And you became both a consumer of the VA benefits, but also an expert on really understanding how these benefits are given, who's taking advantage of these benefits, who is not, and so much so that you have now been brought into a supervisory role to address veteran suicides. From your experience, what do you see are the biggest gaps in the system, and how the Veterans Administration is trying to address them?
Yeah, it's tough to say I'm an expert because, as we know, a lot of the VA stuff changes every chance they get, right? But I think my time at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I went back, used the GI Bill, and got my master's there. I did some research on why aren't veterans seeking benefits when they get out of service, the earned benefits that they've gotten. And what we found in our process is that apathy is a big factor. You come out of the service, you have something to wear, they give you food, you got health care, you got a job, they tell you where to go, transportations, everything's good, so it's like, leave me alone, right? There's uninformed. I was just talking to a veteran on the way over here, Ross, he's a Vietnam vet, just asked me about, like, if I go into an assisted living, are they going to take care of me? A lot of people just don't know what's out there, and so they need to ask. Convenience is a factor for not taking advantage of benefits. Sometimes, I don't know, random example is like the VA home loan isn't always the best deal for a vet and their family. Perception, I think, is a big one. We all, if I mention Phoenix VA, right, everybody thinks about the lists and everything like that. It's like a bad restaurant. If you hear one thing, you'll remember it forever. But the biggest barrier that we found, and I think maybe some vets here can identify with this, is shame. I came back, others didn't. I'm fine, help somebody else. It's probably my least favorite thing to hear from a vet. I view vets benefits as a buffet that everybody gets to eat at, however much you want, however much you've earned, right? And let the VA make that determination. Don't let somebody else, like some barracks lawyer or something, tell you, no, you won't qualify for that, don't even try.
Yeah, Chief Justice Nuss in the first panel talked about how money is being left on the table,
Yeah.
and I'm sure you're finding, for emotional reasons, they're leaving money on the table because they feel someone else needs it. And
Yeah, money, benefits, services. I mean, I just went, at 40, I just went and got fitted for hearing aids. So, there's stuff out there, just ask.
the other thing that you told me about that's really interesting is one of your goals is to try to encourage people to get upstream prevention rather than downstream. What do you mean by that? What's upstream prevention versus downstream?
Yeah, I really like that analogy. So, dealing with veterans suicide prevention of any kind, really, when you do get to the root of the cause, maybe before you get into a situation that's in crisis, there's just so much more options and things that you can do. And so, like, for my job as a community-based intervention lead for the Upper Midwest, we're working with different states on policies. There's three basic areas that we're working on: identify veterans and people in crisis, integrate those veterans to their community, and improve care transitions, and then address lethal means safety and talk about safety planning, right? And so if we, a couple examples, identify veterans through a triage process at a healthcare system, right? That's not necessarily the VA. Maybe you can pluck them out at that point and say, hey, do you know that this is all available to you? Improving care transitions. I don't know how many, as a CVSO for 10 years, a county veteran service officer, I don't know how many calls we got saying, well, they haven't called me back yet, so I might as well, they don't want me there, and just little things like that don't fit. We talked about gaps. I think another thing, tough to talk about, and it's political, but I think over almost 3/4 of veterans who end their life do so by a firearm. And that's not to say that we should take firearms away from people, but there has to be some separation between the vet and that use in order to make progress.
Hector and Travis, I'm curious, Dan talked about filling gaps. Each of you is trying to fill gaps somehow in the system. What are sort of the critical gaps that you see that each of you is trying to fill?
I think for me, it's making sure that veterans get that mental health care, reduce the stigma around getting mental health care, just make it something that you do. I mean, if you twist your ankle, you go see a doctor. If you're feeling kind of edgy, feeling kind of tweaky, you come see one of us. As well as, getting other therapists to become culturally competent, not putting veterans in front of, nothing against interns, but they're just not there yet, unless they've been served. But somebody who's culturally competent and not afraid of what they're about to hear. Veterans come into these services thinking, I can't tell you because you can't handle it, or I'm only here because my wife says if I don't do this, then I'm going to get kicked out, or a judge has ordered me. But then having more therapists that are actually culturally competent and are ready to take that veteran in, do the hard work that they need to do.
For me, I think it was just trying to provide more options. And so again, when we did the survey and barriers of entry to the VA where the health care was paid for, there was transportation and geographic location of where someone lives and how to get to an appointment that they need to go to weekly. If there's a barrier of entry, oftentimes, especially with individuals experiencing mental health issues, they'll just find that as a reason to not go anymore. And so I think for what we're trying to do is just try to raise money and provide whatever option that an individual, the veteran, will find works for them and pay for that.
Yeah, it's even for people that are not in a state of crisis, those types of friction prevents you from doing basic things. But when you are in an emotional state, where you're struggling, it becomes even harder. The smallest things become difficult.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, as all three of you who have experienced profound crisis and sorrow, but each of you was lucky in that you had people to help you. Mm-hmm. In your case, the police, the judge. Everyone helped you. Travis, in your case, the therapist, Brad, who gave you a different way of looking at things. Dan, your brother. When you look at the audience here today, and if they're asking, what is the one thing that I can do to help, what would you say?
I remember Dr. Paula Kaplan when she was alive. She started something called the Welcome Home Johnny and Jane program. But I listened to her speak, and she said that, don't thank a veteran for their service because some of us, we know what we did. And I'm not sure that I wore the white hat or the black hat. I'm not sure if I was a good guy or not, but when she said you could ask a veteran, or you could say to a veteran, I realize that you served on my behalf. Thank you for that, and I'm willing to listen to what you've been through on my behalf. That was like a bridge, and I was like, wow, if somebody would have asked me that, I probably would have, first of all, had my jaw drop to the ground and maybe even teared up, but I'm like, all right, I'll tell you if you want to hear. So I think that's huge. If you want to do something for a veteran, ask what their story is, and then actually listen.
Travis.
Yeah, going off of what Hector said, I think there are many opportunities to get out there and help. You don't need to be a veteran to help a veteran. I think that was one thing that we struggled with at Bill's Wishes. It was just me organizing a bunch of my friends who happened to have a CPA, who happened to be a lawyer, who happened to be a social marketing, none of which were veterans. We did have a few veterans, of course, and wanted to hear their voice, but our whole goal was serving those who've served us. And we wanted to embrace something that at first we thought was, kind of a negative stigma or something that was a detriment to the nonprofit, and we just embraced it. And so I would say, whether you're a veteran or not, just get involved.
Yeah.
Dan?
We never really listened to the flight attendant at the beginning of flights, but that whole put your own mask on before you help your neighbor, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Any veteran in here that isn't looking into what benefits they qualify for, you need to do it yesterday. I think, back to that first conversation with mentors, another thing you should think about putting on there, Colonel, is experience with the VA. With our Veterans Treatment Court, when I was a CVSO, we found that when we started applying some of these older veterans who were mentors for their hearing loss, for their tinnitus, et cetera, they could then walk through their mentees through that process. This is how you get your meds filled. This is how you make an appointment. These little things really matter. And so if you can walk alongside other veterans, I'm a product of that, right? Tony walked alongside me. Now I'm walking alongside other people. Put your own mask on before you help somebody else.
And as we wrap up this conversation, I'm going to ask you a question that I often ask guests on my leadership podcast. Travis, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you first. If you were to look back at your younger self and what you went through and how you responded to that moment of crisis, what would you say to your younger self about the journey that you have been on?
You're not alone. I think for a long time I felt very alone. And I think that's part of what everybody's talked about is reducing the stigma of help-seeking behavior. And it's okay not being okay.
Dan?
Yeah, similarly, I mean, there's a lot of power in being vulnerable. You can learn a lot from it. And if I had to say something to my younger self, I'd say just keep going, you're doing the right thing.
I remember standing in front of my last formation in front of all 167 of the infantrymen that I took down range, and because I had already been through what I call it the throes of my crucible, I was able to look at them and tell them what I wanted to be told or what I probably needed to be told, and I looked at them and said, hey guys, there is no shame in asking for help, but there is shame in handcuffs, so get the help you need.
Well, thank you very much, Hector, Travis, Dan, for sharing your incredible stories and suggesting ways in which everyone in this audience can help the VDP and help each of you help others with this incredibly important task. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And I'll turn it over to Hank for closing comments.
So the good news is we're going to finish early. Let me just thank University of St. Thomas School of Law for hosting this, and the Holleran Center for Ethical Leadership, whose support has made this part possible. I want to thank the VDP board, Brock and Ryan, all our supporters for bringing us here together today. I want to thank our speakers for their passion, for their grief and sorrow, for their advice, and for their hopes. It's about veterans. We're here to acknowledge their service. Saturday's the official day, but I don't think we can do it too many days this week. Could I ask all the veterans in the audience to stand up? And for those online, you maybe can't see the full room, but there were a lot of people standing up, which we're thankful for. I want to note that this is the first of a two-part event. It's the first time we've tried to do this, but we have some of the top professors in the country here tonight who will be speaking here at the same venue tomorrow. They will be speaking on, after their service, the intersection of law and veterans, and topics ranging from what we can be doing on behalf of veteran treatment courts to make them better, to the Native American veteran whose traditions really started restorative justice, if you go back far enough, and what we can be doing on their behalf today, to what is the next generation really need to be focusing on. In particular, we have lunch speakers who will talk to, I hope, my faculty colleagues here about why every law school can benefit from having a veterans law clinic. Everybody's invited. There's I think programs back there, or you can just talk to one of our law students if you want to get more details. We'll start at 9 o'clock tomorrow. We'll be finished by 3. You can come for all or part of the entire symposium if you're able. For those who are present, we will repeat what we did last year and have a reception over to my right, and we hope that you will stay and have a chance to engage in some Q&A. The format we put together, again, didn't permit for the audience interaction that we always like, but you will have the chance now for the next 45 minutes or almost an hour to interact with the people that you've heard speak here, hear more about their stories, hear more about how the VDP could use your help, and we could also find out more about you. What I do every year here at St. Thomas for my classes is close with a poem, prayer, some call it both. I think it's a reminder for students, but I think for everybody why Veterans Day is so important. It was written by a U.S. Army veteran by the name of Charles Province, but it's been modified over the years, and there's actually a number of different versions on the internet, and I'm just going to share one of them with you. It's entitled, It is the soldier. But I think to be inclusive and to be fair, it should be, it is the service member. It is everybody who has worn the uniform. It is the soldier, not the reporter, that has given us freedom of the press. It is the soldier, not the clergyman, that has given us freedom of religion. It is the soldier, not the poet, that has given us freedom of speech. It is the soldier, not the campus organizer, that has given us the freedom to demonstrate. It is the soldier, not the lawyer, that has given us the right to a fair trial. It is the soldier who follows the flag into battle, who salutes the flag, whose coffin is draped by the flag. It is the soldier. It has always been the soldier. Thank you for joining us. I thank the audience on the live stream, and for those present, let's continue the discussion. Take care.
They don't tell you when you join the military that you're going to walk down the streets of Baghdad and you're going to see kids that have been crucified to telephone poles and shot with RPGs. They don't tell you what it's like to see a suicide bomb go off and kill 165 people and maim 300 other people.
Since 1980, we've known about PTSD, we've known about the effects of war, and we've continued to send people to war. That decision comes with the weight that we have to help the people that come back. Until we make it a priority to help them on their way out, we've got to deal with this stuff on the backside. And the idea of therapeutic jurisprudence has just taken a really long time to develop.
People who actually do the fighting and get recycled through that several times, there should be an understanding of what that can create.
I was definitely skirting the line of being a soldier and like a gangster almost.
Many veterans struggling with untreated combat trauma are very resistant to acknowledging that they have a problem.
I never wanted to deal with it. I didn't want to go to the VA. But I always saw the VA was just this horrible place. And if you needed to go to the VA, you needed to go because you were missing a leg or you were missing your arm, not because you had mental health issues that you were dealing with.
And I'm watching these guys going to jail and going, nobody's ever treated what got them here. And they wonder why their family's falling apart and they're falling apart. I don't wonder.
Sitting in the cop car, I felt like my life was done. I had skated that thin line way too much, and now this was it. And then they asked me, have you ever thought about suicide? Yes. Have you ever, tried to kill yourself? Yes. And they put me in solitary confinement.
Once their trauma leads to an act that brings them in the criminal justice system, we can treat them like anybody else in the justice system and punish their behavior and put them back out on the streets. But we know from the Vietnam veteran experience that that just doesn't tend to work. If a veteran's coming into that treatment as part of a court-ordered program, they now have incentive to see that through.
One of the things that I had to check with my ego was going to the VA and telling my psychologist how hard that was for me. I'm this person that has dreams for my life. I'm this person that, never gotten a fight before. And then there's this other person that has been to Iraq, killed people. You can hold both those truths at the same time. But that, super violent, super intense person, I've grown out of that. Like a cocoon, I'm a butterfly.
It's a question of massive education to make people understand that we're not trying to give people a free pass. We're trying to give them a helping hand to fix whatever's wrong so that they can lead productive lives.
These other states, if they want to consider their veterans courts, then they need to definitely look at the outcomes for veterans in Minnesota and ask themselves, do you want to help veterans or do you not want to help veterans? Because sometimes it's that simple.